The security guard ripped off my sergeant stripes, threw them in the trash, and told a crowd of Gold Star families, "Real combat veterans don't end up like this." When I tried to stand up for myself, he laughed and said, "You probably bought that jacket at a thrift store like everything else in your life." I didn't say a word. That was 8 months ago. Last week, I watched him cry in court as the jury read the guilty verdict. Army security guards threw me out of an event for looking homeless, not knowing I was there to receive a Medal of Honor. I'd been sleeping rough for 3 months when I got the letter telling me to report to the state capitol building for a ceremony honoring our state's veterans. My dress uniform was in storage somewhere I couldn't afford to access anymore, so I showed up in the only clothes I owned, which were a stained army jacket from Goodwill and jeans that had seen better days. What the security guards at the entrance didn't know was that I was the guest of honor they'd been briefed to expect. The first guard, a thick guy named Ryan according to his badge, took one look at me and stepped directly in my path before I could reach the metal detector. "This is a government building hosting an official ceremony, not a soup kitchen," he said loud enough for everyone in line to hear, while his partner Walker moved to flank me. I tried explaining that I was invited and pulled out my crumpled letter, but Ryan snatched it from my hands without reading it and tossed it behind him. "Nice try, but we've heard every story from you people trying to get inside for the free food and publicity." Walker grabbed my arm and started steering me toward the exit, while announcing to the growing crowd that they dealt with this all the time. "These homeless drunks always claim they're veterans whenever there's an event," he said, while tightening his grip hard enough to leave marks. When I mentioned I'd served in Afghanistan, Ryan actually laughed and asked if I meant I'd served food at the local Afghan restaurant, before presumably getting fired for stealing from the register. They pushed me outside, but I came back 10 minutes later through a different entrance, only to have Ryan spot me immediately and call 3 more guards over. "This drunk is back and now he's trying to sneak in," he announced over his radio while the new guards surrounded me. One of them wrinkled his nose and sprayed air freshener directly in my face, saying I smelled like I'd been marinating in my own piss for weeks, which was probably true since the shelter only allowed 2 showers per week. Walker decided to search me for weapons, which meant emptying my pockets onto the floor and kicking through my belongings with his boot. He found my VA medical card and held it up for everyone to see. "Look at this fake ID he probably bought online," he said, before bending it back and forth until it cracked. "Real veterans have pride and dignity, not whatever crawled out of the gutter this morning pretending to be a hero." Then Ryan noticed my army jacket had sergeant stripes that were barely holding on with old thread. He grabbed them and ripped them off completely, throwing them in the trash while telling me that stolen valor was a federal crime. "You probably bought this at a thrift store and thought you could fool people into giving you handouts and respect you never earned," he said, while the gathering crowd of ceremony attendees watched in disgust. That's when I made the mistake of mentioning my Purple Heart, which sent Walker into a rage that had him shoving me against the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of me. "You lying piece of shit," he screamed in my face while his spit hit my cheek. "My brother died earning his Purple Heart, and here you are disgracing every real soldier by claiming you have one too, when you've probably never even held a weapon that wasn't a bottle." Ryan pulled up a chair and forced me to sit while he called over more people to witness what he called a teaching moment about how to spot fake veterans. He pointed at my shaking hands and told everyone it was from alcohol withdrawal, not PTSD like I claimed. "Real combat veterans don't end up like this," he announced to the crowd. "This is just another drunk who wants to steal the honor of better men who actually sacrificed for this country, instead of just leeching off it." When he shoved me, felt the medication bottles in my pocket, and that was like catnip for him. He read the labels out loud to everyone, making jokes about how many psych meds I was on. "Looks like someone raided a pharmacy or more likely a dumpster behind one," he said while crushing one of the bottles under his heel. "These are probably why he thinks he's some kind of war hero when he's really just another crazy homeless guy who belongs in an institution, not at a ceremony for real patriots." They dragged me toward the exit again, but this time Ryan made sure to do it in front of the arriving Gold Star families, telling them loudly that they'd caught another faker trying to infiltrate their sacred ceremony. "This is what disrespect looks like," he announced while forcing me to my knees in front of them. "Some drunk wearing a costume thinking he can share space with families who actually lost heroes in combat." Just then, the governor's aide came running over looking panicked, asking if they'd seen the Medal of Honor recipient who was supposed to arrive 30 minutes ago. She was holding a photo and turned it toward the guards, and Ryan's face went completely white as he looked from the picture to me kneeling on the ground in the same clothes. "That's him," she said urgently. "Sergeant First Class Michael Torres. He's receiving the Medal of Honor today for saving 12 soldiers in Kandahar." Walker's hand released my arm like he'd been electrocuted. The aide pushed past Ryan and dropped to her knees beside me, holding the photo right in front of his face while her hands shook. "This is him. This is Sergeant Torres," she kept saying while Ryan stared at the picture, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might pass out right there in the marble lobby. My pills were scattered everywhere, orange prescription bottles rolling across the floor where people stepped on them, crushing the medication I needed to function. Ryan's eyes tracked from the photo to my face to the crushed pills under his own boot, and I could see the exact moment his brain processed what he'd done. The lobby doors burst open, and Governor Hawthorne herself came striding out with her security detail, probably wondering why her Medal of Honor recipient was 30 minutes late to his own ceremony. She took one look at me on my knees with medication scattered everywhere and guards standing over me, and her political smile froze on her face. Camera phones were already out. Dozens of them pointed at us from every angle as people realized something big was happening. Ryan's hands started shaking as he reached down to grab my arm, trying to pull me up while whispering apologies that came out as panicked gasps. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. Please stand up," he kept saying while his grip slipped on my arm because his palms were sweating so bad. The other guards who'd been so eager to help him rough me up were backing away fast, melting into the crowd like they'd never been there. Walker had completely vanished, leaving Ryan alone in the circle of phones recording everything. My legs wouldn't work right when I tried to stand. 3 months of barely eating and sleeping on concrete had left me weaker than I realized. The aide grabbed my other arm to help, but I still stumbled, nearly falling again before Ryan caught me. Governor Hawthorne was already in full damage control mode, her voice carrying across the lobby as she announced loudly enough for every camera to catch it. "Sergeant Torres, I am am deeply sorry for this treatment. She shot a look at Ryan that could have melted steel while he stood there with his career evaporating in real time. Reporters were pushing forward now, shoving microphones toward us while shouting questions about what happened. I reached for my scattered pills, but half of them were crushed beyond use, including the anti-anxiety meds that kept the worst of my PTSD symptoms under control. My hands shook worse as I picked up the pieces of a bottle that had my name clearly printed on the label Ryan had mocked as fake. Without those pills, I'd be dealing with full withdrawal symptoms within hours, and I couldn't afford to refill them for another 2 weeks. The governor's security detail formed a barrier around us while she personally bent down to help me gather what was left of my belongings. Each destroyed pill felt like a punch to the gut because I knew exactly how many days of rationing I'd have to do to make the surviving ones last. She picked up my cracked VA card that Walker had bent back and forth, smoothing it between her fingers while cameras captured every second. Ryan tried to explain to his supervisors who came running over, but his words came out as stuttered fragments about not knowing and just doing his job. He looked homeless. He smelled bad. I thought he was lying, he kept saying while sweat poured down his face. The supervisors stared at him in horror as they realized he'd assaulted and publicly humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient while calling him a fake veteran in front of Gold Star families. His partner Walker was nowhere to be found, probably already updating his resume in a bathroom stall somewhere. 20 minutes later, I sat in a medical room while a nurse documented the bruises on my arm from where the guards had grabbed me. The governor hovered nearby, her staff frantically making phone calls and managing what was already becoming a viral PR disaster. Someone had found me borrowed clothes that hung loose on my skinny frame, making me look even more pathetic than before. The door opened and Colonel Mitchell walked in, my former commanding officer who'd recommended me for the Medal of Honor after Kandahar. He took one look at me sitting there with hollow eyes and ribs showing through the borrowed shirt, and his jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. Mitchell pulled a chair over and sat down hard, his face getting redder by the second as he stared at my skinny arms and the way my borrowed shirt hung off me like I was wearing my dad's clothes. Something feels really calculated about Ryan going from tough security guard to sweating mess the second that photo comes out. I wonder if he's dealt with situations like this before and just never got caught. His hands kept opening and closing into fists while he looked me up and down, taking in every detail of what 3 months on the streets had done to the soldier he'd recommended for the highest military honor. The medical staff came in with a clipboard and started checking my vitals, writing down numbers that made them frown and whisper to each other about severe malnutrition and dehydration that needed immediate treatment. Mitchell finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, as he asked how long I'd been living rough, and when I held up 3 fingers for 3 months, something in his face just broke. I tried to explain about the apartment fire that took everything, how the VA benefits got tangled up in red tape when I couldn't prove my address anymore, how one missed appointment led to another until the whole system just forgot about me. The nurse interrupted to say I needed IV fluids and psychiatric medication replacement right away, but then she asked for my insurance information, and I had to tell her that Ryan had destroyed my VA card along with everything else in my pockets. She looked confused and said they'd have to figure out another way to process the treatment, which meant more forms and more waiting while my body kept shaking from withdrawal. That's when the governor's aide burst through the door holding her phone up, showing us a video that was already spreading across social media like wildfire. The footage showed Ryan calling me a fake veteran and destroying my medication while the crowd watched, and the view count was climbing past 50,000 shares in just the last hour. The aide kept talking about damage control and public relations disasters while showing us comments flooding in from angry veterans and their families demanding justice. Through the window, I could see protesters already gathering outside the building with signs about homeless veterans and security abuse. The governor herself came in next, her face pale as she watched the video on her aide's phone, and she immediately ordered someone to bring Ryan in for questioning. Through the open doorway, I watched security officers escort Ryan to their office, his face completely white as he kept mumbling about following protocol and just doing his job to protect the ceremony from unauthorized people. The governor turned to me and insisted she would personally escort me to the ceremony hall, but when I tried to stand up, my legs wobbled so bad I had to grab the exam table to keep from falling. The medication withdrawal was hitting hard now, making everything spin while my empty stomach cramped from months of irregular meals and whatever I could find in dumpsters. Mitchell had to support me on one side while a nurse held my other arm, and we made this sad little parade through the hallways toward the ceremony that was supposed to honor my service. The moment we stepped into the main corridor, news crews swarmed us with cameras and microphones, shouting questions about veteran homelessness and how many others might be suffering like me. The governor tried to shield me from the cameras, but the bright lights made me flinch and duck, my PTSD kicking in as the flashes reminded me of muzzle fire in Kandahar. My whole body tensed up, and I nearly dropped to the floor in a defensive position before Mitchell's grip kept me upright. He steered me into a quiet alcove away from the cameras, both hands on my shoulders now as he looked me straight in the eye. His voice cracked when he told me they don't leave soldiers behind, that he'd failed me, and it ended today, that he should have checked on me after I got back instead of assuming the system would take care of its heroes. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but my throat was too tight and the withdrawal was making it hard to form words. The ceremony music started playing in the main hall, and the governor said we needed to go, but every step felt like walking through mud with weights on my feet. Inside the ceremony hall, hundreds of people turned to stare as we entered, and I could barely focus on any of their faces through the fog in my head. Every noise made me jump. Every camera flash sent me back to that night in Kandahar when the explosions lit up the sky, and I had to choose between saving myself or going back for my squad. My hands were shaking so bad now that I had to shove them in my pockets, but that just made the borrowed pants start sliding down since they were too big for my skinny waist. When we reached the stage for the medal presentation, the governor started reading from prepared remarks about valor and sacrifice, but her words sounded like they were coming from underwater. She held up the Medal of Honor and tried to pin it on my borrowed shirt, but my hands were shaking too violently for her to manage it alone. She had to hold my chest steady while her aide helped guide the pin through the fabric, and I could hear people in the audience whispering about whether I I was drunk or having some kind of breakdown. The weight of the metal pulled the loose shirt down even more, making me look even more pathetic than before. That's when I spotted a face in the crowd that made my heart stop completely. My brother Marcus was sitting in the third row with tears streaming down his face, his wife Sarah holding his hand while they both stared at me like they were seeing a ghost. I hadn't seen them in 2 years, not since I'd stopped returning their calls because I was too ashamed to admit how bad things had gotten. The governor's security chief was already pushing through the crowd toward Ryan and Walker, his face dark with fury as he grabbed Ryan's shoulder and spun him around. The chief's badge said Henderson, and he looked ready to explode as he pointed at me, still kneeling on the marble floor. "You just assaulted our guest of honor," he said in a voice that made everyone nearby step back. Ryan tried to explain that I looked homeless and had been acting suspicious, but Henderson cut him off with a sharp gesture. The chief helped me to my feet while ordering both guards to surrender their badges and weapons immediately. Ryan's hands shook as he unclipped his badge, and I could see the moment it hit him that his career was over. Henderson called 2 other guards over and told them to escort Ryan and Walker to the security office to wait for the police. Through the massive windows, I watched them march Ryan out, his head down and shoulders slumped, while photographers outside caught every second of his walk of shame. The ceremony itself passed in a blur, with the governor pinning the medal on my chest, while hundreds of people applauded. But all I could think about was Marcus sitting there watching his homeless brother get honored by the state. After the governor finished her speech and the official photos were done, I saw Marcus making his way through the crowd toward me. His eyes were red, and he kept wiping his face as he got closer. And when he finally reached me, he just stood there for a long moment before speaking. "Why didn't you call?" he asked, his voice cracking on the words. I couldn't find the words to explain how the shame had eaten at me, how I'd rather sleep under bridges than admit to my successful brother that I'd lost everything. The governor's aide appeared at my elbow with an envelope, explaining it contained a hotel voucher for 2 weeks and information about expedited VA services. She promised they'd fast-track my benefits and get me housing, but I'd heard these promises before from a dozen different agencies. What scared me most was that my medication had run out 3 days ago, and the tremors were already starting again. That evening, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the first real bed I'd seen in months, but sleep wouldn't come. The mattress felt too soft after months of concrete, the silence too complete without the sounds of traffic and other homeless people nearby. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on the street, and every small noise made me jump up ready to defend my belongings. Around midnight, someone knocked on my door, and I found Colonel Mitchell standing there with a woman in a white coat who introduced herself as Dr. Moore from the VA. She took one look at me, and her professional mask slipped for just a second, showing genuine shock at my condition. Mitchell carried in several bags from the pharmacy, while Dr. Moore checked my vitals and asked about my medications. She pulled out prescription bottles and started explaining dosages, but her hands paused when she saw the bruises Walker had left on my arms. The next morning, my hotel phone rang, and the desk clerk said I had an urgent call from a law firm. The lawyer on the other end introduced himself as Ryan's attorney and immediately launched into threats about defamation and false imprisonment charges. He claimed I'd been aggressive and appeared intoxicated, that the security guards had followed proper protocol for dealing with a potentially dangerous individual. When I hung up, Dr. Moore was already documenting my injuries with her phone camera, measuring the bruises and noting the dates. "This isn't just about today," she said while typing notes into her tablet. "This is about systematic failure." She explained how she'd be filing reports with multiple agencies about my condition and the medication lapse. Later that afternoon, Marcus came back to the hotel with a folder in his hands. He sat across from me and pulled out photos of 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, wearing Little League uniforms and smiling at the camera. "They should know their uncle is a hero," he said, but the word hero felt like a joke when I couldn't even keep a roof over my head. The next day, everything exploded when a reporter figured out Marcus was my brother. By noon, there were news vans parked outside his house, and his wife Sarah called me crying because she couldn't get the kids to school without being mobbed. Marcus's boss called him into the office to complain about the disruption to their workplace, and Sarah worried about strangers knowing where their children went to school. Mitchell's face cracking like a dropped phone screen when he sees his Medal of Honor pick living off dumpster leftovers is the kind of plot twist that makes security guards everywhere check their job descriptions twice. That afternoon, the governor held a press conference announcing a full review of veteran services in the state, with Ryan's actions held up as an example of how the system failed those who served. She promised investigations and reforms, but I just wanted my life back, wanted to stop being a symbol and just be a person again. The next morning, I woke up in Marcus's guest room feeling worse than I had in weeks, my body shaking and sweating through the sheets even though the room was cold. Marcus drove me to the VA hospital where they ran a bunch of tests that took most of the day, and when the doctor came back with the results, her face told me everything before she even opened her mouth. The malnutrition from living on the streets had stressed my liver and kidneys to the point where I was looking at permanent damage if I didn't get immediate treatment. But the kind of treatment they were talking about meant regular meals and stable housing and monitoring that you couldn't do from a shelter bed. She showed me the numbers on my blood work and explained how my organs were basically eating themselves trying to keep me alive. And the worst part was that even with the Medal of Honor ceremony coming up, I still didn't have anywhere stable to live once Marcus's hospitality ran out. That same afternoon, while I was still hooked up to an IV getting fluids, Marcus texted me a link to the local news where Ryan was sitting across from a reporter in a nice suit, talking about how the incident at the Capitol wasn't his fault. He had his own lawyer now who kept nodding while Ryan explained that he'd been attacked by a homeless man 2 years ago, which gave him PTSD and made him hypervigilant about security threats, painting himself as the real victim who was just trying to protect people from what he thought was a dangerous situation. The reporter ate it up, asking sympathetic questions about how hard it must be to work security with that kind of trauma, and Ryan actually started tearing up talking about how he never meant to hurt a veteran, but his training kicked in when he saw someone who looked threatening. His lawyer mentioned they were considering their own lawsuit for defamation since the video going viral had destroyed Ryan's reputation and caused him emotional distress, which made me want to throw the remote at the TV. The next day, Colonel Mitchell picked me up from the hospital to help me get into my storage unit since I needed my papers and maybe could could find some decent clothes, but when we got to the facility, the manager just shook his head. The unit had been auctioned off 3 months ago when I couldn't pay. Everything inside sold to the highest bidder, including my dress uniform and all my photos from deployment and the flag from my dad's funeral. Mitchell asked if they kept records of who bought what, but the manager said it was all cash sales, and the buyers hauled everything away in trucks. So 20 years of my life was just gone, scattered to pawn shops and garage sales across the city. I stood there staring at the empty concrete box where my life used to be stored, while Mitchell put his hand on my shoulder, and then we walked back to his car in silence. Sitting in the passenger seat, I finally lost it completely, sobbing like I hadn't since coming home from Afghanistan, because the medal they were giving me felt like a joke when I couldn't even keep my own belongings safe. Mitchell didn't say anything stupid about how it would be okay, or how the medal was what really mattered. He just sat there with me while I fell apart, understanding that sometimes there weren't any words that could fix things. 3 days later, Marcus called me at the motel where the VA had put me up temporarily, his voice tight as he explained that his boss had suggested he take some time off until the media attention died down. The company was getting calls from reporters and protesters, and it was disrupting business. Plus, some clients were nervous about the controversy and threatening to take their contracts elsewhere. His wife was already stressed about money with their kid needing braces, and now he might lose pay because of me, and I could hear the strain in his voice even though he kept saying it wasn't my fault. Meanwhile, Dr. Moore at the VA was spending hours on the phone trying to get my medications approved through insurance, getting transferred from department to department, and having to explain my whole situation over and over to people who put her on hold for 20 minutes at a time. She had to file 3 different appeals because they kept denying coverage, saying I hadn't tried cheaper alternatives first, even though she explained those alternatives would interact badly with my other conditions. Each call meant starting over with a new representative who had no record of the previous conversations, and she was doing this between seeing other patients because the VA was understaffed and overwhelmed. Outside the security company's headquarters, protesters had started gathering with signs demanding Ryan be fired, but they were met by counter-protesters who claimed veterans were milking the system for sympathy and handouts. The two groups screamed at each other while news crews filmed it all, and somehow I'd become a symbol in a fight I never wanted to be part of, with people using my name to score political points on both sides. Someone leaked my motel address and reporters started showing up at all hours, forcing the VA to move me to a different location for my own safety. At my group therapy session at the VA, the other homeless vets just looked tired when my story came up. One guy saying at least mine was filmed so people couldn't deny it happened. He told his own story about being turned away from a job interview for looking suspicious. Another talked about being kicked out of a library for falling asleep while trying to use the computer to apply for benefits, and they all had variations of the same experience of being treated like garbage while their service was forgotten. The therapist tried to keep things positive, but you could see in her eyes she'd heard it all before, and nothing was really changing except now one of us was famous for it. I started applying for jobs thinking the Medal of Honor might actually help, but background checks kept turning up the same problems, with gaps in employment from being homeless and no recent references, because I'd lost touch with everyone while living on the streets. Employers would get excited seeing Medal of Honor recipient on the application, then concerned when they saw unstable housing history and gaps they couldn't explain, and I could tell they were wondering if I was one of those veterans who'd snap under pressure. The worst part was 5 days later when Ryan's lawyer subpoenaed my medical records, claiming my behavior at the Capitol showed signs of drug intoxication, and they needed to verify I wasn't high during the incident. Having strangers paw through my psychiatric files and medication history felt like being violated all over again. My private struggles with PTSD and depression laid out for lawyers to twist into evidence that I was unstable and dangerous. That's when my lawyer called me at 6 in the morning with news that made me drop my coffee mug on the hotel carpet. Someone had sent him security footage from a camera angle the Capitol building didn't even know existed, showing Ryan sliding my VA card into his own pocket after he bent it in half. The timestamp showed it happening right after he'd told everyone it was fake, and you could see him looking around first to make sure nobody was watching before he pocketed what was clearly government property. My lawyer said destroying or stealing a veteran's official ID was a federal crime that could mean serious prison time, and suddenly Ryan's whole story about me being some drunk faker started falling apart, because why would he steal a fake ID? The governor called me that afternoon while I was still trying to process everything, offering me a position in the state's Veteran Affairs Office, where I could help other vets navigate the system and make sure what happened to me never happened to anyone else. I sat there in my hotel room staring at dirty clothes I hadn't washed in days and empty pill bottles I kept forgetting to refill, knowing I could barely remember to brush my teeth most mornings, let alone help anybody else with their problems. The weight of being some kind of success story when I still woke up screaming from nightmares and couldn't handle crowds without breaking into cold sweats felt like another medal I didn't deserve. Marcus invited me to dinner at his house that weekend to celebrate the job offer, but his wife Sarah barely looked at me the whole meal and kept their kids in the other room watching TV instead of eating with us like usual. After Marcus went to check on them, she finally admitted she'd been reading all the news stories about my PTSD and the incident at the Capitol, and she was scared of what I might do if I had another episode around their children. Marcus came back and defended me, saying I'd never hurt anyone, but I could see the strain in his eyes and the way Sarah flinched when I reached for the salt shaker too quickly. The next week I started looking for apartments since the hotel voucher would run out soon, but every landlord who seemed interested suddenly had the place rented when they recognized my face from the news coverage. One property manager straight up told me they couldn't risk having someone with my issues living there because other tenants would complain, and another asked if I was the crazy vet who attacked security guards at the Capitol, even though that's not what happened at all. Colonel Mitchell heard about my housing problems and organized a whole group of local veterans to help me out, setting up a fund to cover deposits and even offering to co-sign leases, but accepting their help when so many other vets were still sleeping under bridges felt wrong. Wow, the security footage showing Ryan pocketing Jake's VA card is such a weird twist. Why would he keep evidence that proves he was lying? I'm really curious what goes through someone's mind when they destroy something something, then secretly take it home. I kept thinking about all the guys I'd served with who came home just as broken, but didn't have medals or media attention to help them, and taking resources that could go to them made me feel like more of a fraud than Ryan ever accused me of being. Then my lawyer got another video, this one from a tourist's phone showing a different angle where you could clearly see Walker dropping something into my jacket pocket during the search, his hand moving quick and practiced like he'd done it before. The prosecutor opened a criminal investigation into both guards, saying it looked like they might have been planning to plant drugs or weapons on me to justify an arrest, which explained why they'd been so aggressive about searching me in the first place. I had to meet with investigators multiple times that week, going over every detail again while they showed me frame-by-frame footage of my humiliation, and each session left me shaking so bad I couldn't drive myself back to the hotel. Dr. Moore at the VA pulled me aside after one particularly rough therapy session, looking at my charts with deep concern in her eyes. She told me straight up that the stress from the legal battles and media attention was undoing months of treatment progress, that my blood pressure was dangerously high, and my PTSD symptoms were getting worse instead of better. And then she said something that hit hard, that I'd survived Kandahar, but this might be what finally breaks me. The security company threw Ryan under the bus as soon as the investigation heated up, firing him immediately, and putting out a statement saying he'd violated every policy they had and acted entirely on his own without any authorization from management. Their lawyers started arguing that the company held no liability for his actions since he'd gone rogue, basically abandoning him to face federal charges alone while they protected their government contracts. 3 weeks into this mess, I couldn't sleep anymore and found myself walking past the spot where I used to sleep behind the dumpsters before all this started. Another vet was there now, an older guy with a prosthetic leg who'd set up a decent camp with a tarp and sleeping bag, and when I sat down to talk with him, he told me he'd been on the streets for 2 years since his disability payments got cut. I still had 5 days left on my hotel voucher, but gave it to him instead, watching his face light up at the thought of a real bed and hot shower, and somehow that felt more honest than pretending I deserved special treatment just because I'd been on TV. The guilt got even worse when Marcus showed up at my hotel the next day with paperwork from a mortgage refinance, telling me he'd pulled equity out of his house to pay for a real legal team since the public defender was overwhelmed with cases. Watching my little brother sign papers that could cost him his family's home if anything went wrong hit me harder than any physical pain I'd felt in Afghanistan, and I begged him not to do it, but he said family takes care of family no matter what. 2 days later, I was counting my pills in the hotel bathroom when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman was crying so hard she could barely get words out between sobs. She finally managed to tell me she was Ryan's wife, and she was 8 months pregnant with their third kid, begging me to please drop the charges because they'd already suspended him without pay, and she didn't know how they'd feed their kids if he went to prison. I sat there on the closed toilet lid, listening to her describe how their oldest had special needs and required expensive therapy that only Ryan's insurance covered, how they'd just bought a house with a mortgage based on his salary, how he'd been different since his brother died in Iraq and sometimes took his anger out on the wrong people, but he was still a good father who coached Little League and never missed a school play. The bottle of anxiety meds in my hand was already half empty, even though I just filled the prescription 3 days ago, and I realized I'd been taking double doses again without thinking about it, trying to keep the shaking under control during all the meetings with lawyers and reporters. She kept saying she knew what he did was wrong but couldn't. I understand that destroying their whole family wouldn't fix anything, that her kids didn't deserve to lose their dad over one bad day, and I found myself thinking about my own ex-wife and daughter, how they'd watched me fall apart after my third deployment until there was nothing left of the man they'd loved. I told her I'd think about it and hung up, then went back to rationing my pills into daily containers, noticing my hands were shaking worse than usual as I tried to make a month's supply last 6 weeks like I'd done when I was on the streets, because even with insurance, the copays were adding up faster than the disability checks came in. The next morning, my lawyer called to say the federal prosecutors had gotten involved and were treating it as a civil rights case with potential hate crime enhancements, which meant even if I wanted to drop the charges, it was out of my hands now because the government wanted to make an example out of what happened. Over the next few weeks, investigators kept showing up at the hotel to interview me again and again, each time pushing for more details about exactly what Ryan and Walker had said, how many people had witnessed it, whether I'd noticed a pattern of them targeting other homeless people, and I could tell they were building something bigger than just my case. Then Marcus called me at 2 in the morning, his voice tight with fear, saying someone had spray-painted snitch across his garage door and left a dead cat on his doorstep with a note saying his kids would be next if I didn't back off the case. I could hear his wife crying in the background, demanding they pack up and leave town, while his kids kept asking why they couldn't go outside to play anymore, and I realized my war had followed me home in ways I'd never imagined it could. The security company Marcus hired said his house needed cameras, reinforced doors, and panic buttons, which cost another $8,000 he didn't have, and watching him take out another loan while his children needed escorts to get to school made me wish I'd just let Ryan and Walker throw me out that day and never said anything. 2 days later, the governor showed up at my hotel with cameras and reporters, promising she'd personally ensure I got permanent housing through a new veterans program, but before she even left the parking lot, her opponent was on the news calling it political theater with taxpayer money and demanding an investigation into whether she was buying my testimony with government benefits. At my next medical appointment, the doctor ran tests that had been postponed for months while I was homeless, and her face went pale looking at the results as she explained my liver was showing damage consistent with untreated infections, probably from contaminated water or food I'd consumed on the streets, and we needed to start aggressive treatment immediately or I might need a transplant within the year. She kept asking when I'd first noticed symptoms like the yellow tinge to my eyes or the pain in my side, but I couldn't remember because when you're homeless, you ignore everything that isn't immediately life-threatening, and by the time you can afford to care, it's usually too late. Then the prosecutor called with news that Walker wanted to make a deal, ready to testify about how he and Ryan had made a game out of hassling homeless people, competing to see who could get them to leave the area fastest, keeping score of how many they'd driven away from the government buildings where they worked. worked. He had recordings on his phone of Ryan bragging about making a Vietnam vet cry by ripping off his service patches, photos of them posing with confiscated belongings they'd taken from people's camps, text messages joking about how they were cleaning up the streets one bum at a time, and placing bets on which ones were actually veterans versus just pretending. By the third month, I could barely walk from the hotel bed to the bathroom without stopping to catch my breath, and the physical therapist kept exchanging worried looks with her assistant as I struggled to do exercises that should have been simple for someone my age. They spoke in hushed voices about permanent limitations and adjusted expectations, while I tried to lift a 2-pound weight with arms that used to carry wounded soldiers out of firefights, and I could see them writing notes about muscle deterioration and nerve damage that probably started during those months of sleeping on concrete but would never fully heal. During group therapy at the VA, Tommy, who'd been in our homeless camp before getting housed, didn't show up for 3 sessions straight, and then we found out he'd tried to kill himself after being denied disability benefits for the 4th time, leaving a note saying he was tired of fighting a system that demanded proof of invisible wounds while making it impossible to get the help that would prove they were real. The colonel had set up a job interview for me with a defense contractor who owed him a favor, but sitting in that office wearing a borrowed suit, I felt the walls closing in and my chest getting tight, and before I could even answer the first question about my experience, I was hyperventilating so bad they had to call paramedics. The interviewer tried to hide his discomfort as EMTs checked my vitals in his conference room, but I could see that look I'd gotten used to. The one that said no matter what medals I'd earned, I was now just another broken veteran who'd become a liability instead of an asset, and his polite rejection email came before I even made it back to the hotel. Marcus showed up at the hotel lobby the next morning with his 2 boys, 8 and 10 years old, both wearing their soccer uniforms and staring at me like I was some kind of zoo animal, while Marcus tried to act like everything was normal. Ryan's wife calling while 8 months pregnant to beg for drop charges feels really convenient timing, and I wonder if someone coached her on exactly what emotional buttons to push with another struggling veteran. The older one, Jake, kept looking at my shaking hands and then at his dad, and I could see Marcus getting more uncomfortable by the second as we sat in the breakfast area where other guests kept glancing over at us. "Dad says you got a medal for being brave," the younger one, Tyler, said while kicking his legs under the table, and I just nodded because what else could I say to a kid who thought medals meant something good instead of nightmares that never stopped? Jake asked if he could see it, and I had to explain it was being kept safe somewhere else, which was true since the governor's office had it for some ceremony they kept postponing. And Tyler wanted to know if I killed bad guys like in his video games, which made Marcus choke on his coffee. The questions kept coming, innocent and brutal at the same time, until Marcus finally said they had to get to practice, and I watched them leave, the boys running ahead while Marcus looked back at me with this expression that said he didn't know how to explain to his kids why their uncle lived in a hotel and couldn't stop shaking. 3 months passed before Ryan's trial started, and walking into that courthouse felt like stepping back into combat, except this time the enemy was wearing a cheap suit instead of body armor. Ryan sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched forward and his hands folded in his lap like he was praying. But when he turned and saw me, his face went hard again for just a second before his lawyer grabbed his arm. The prosecutor had warned me this would take weeks, maybe months, but sitting there listening to opening statements about assault and civil rights violations felt hollow when all I really wanted was to forget any of it happened. Then the testimony started, and Ryan's lawyer brought up his military record, how he'd served 2 tours in Iraq before getting discharged for striking a superior officer, and suddenly I understood why he'd hated me so much, seeing in me everything he'd lost or maybe never had. The pattern became clear as witness after witness described similar incidents at the Capitol building, other veterans Ryan had targeted, always the ones who looked vulnerable or homeless, and his partner testified about how Ryan kept a notebook rating different takedowns like it was some kind of game. My hotel manager called during a recess to tell me they couldn't extend my stay any longer, that corporate had rules about long-term guests, and Marcus immediately said I could stay with him, but I knew his homeowners association had already been asking questions about my visits. Sure enough, within days of me moving some boxes into his garage, he got a letter about maintaining neighborhood standards and concerns about property values that basically meant they didn't want someone who looked like me around their kids. The trial dragged on, and then the prosecutor played the wire recording. Ryan's partner had been wearing a wire for weeks as part of a plea deal, and there was Ryan's voice clear as day talking about teaching fake heroes lessons, bragging about the veterans he'd humiliated, saying he was doing a public service by exposing frauds, even though he never actually checked if anyone was really a fraud. The judge had to call a recess when Ryan started yelling that the recording was taken out of context, his lawyer trying to calm him down while the jury watched with these expressions that said they'd already made up their minds. But I felt nothing, just empty, because destroying Ryan wouldn't give me back the months I'd lost or make the nightmares stop. Every reporter in the state wanted an interview, but each one felt like reliving the whole thing again. Their questions designed to make me emotional for better footage, while they pretended to care about veteran homelessness for exactly as long as the story stayed hot. Dr. Moore adjusted my medications again during our 5th session that month, trying different combinations to help with the anxiety and depression, but she kept saying recovery wasn't linear, like that was supposed to make me feel better about sliding backward. Marcus's wife, Sarah, finally broke during dinner one night, tears streaming down her face as she told him he had to choose between helping me and keeping his family together, that the boys were asking questions she couldn't answer, and the neighbors were talking, and she just wanted their normal life back. The governor's veteran initiative that had promised so much started falling apart as election season ramped up, the budget mysteriously disappearing into other projects, while politicians made excuses about fiscal responsibility and changing priorities. Even my support group at the VA started treating me different, rolling their eyes when I mentioned the trial or the media attention, one guy actually saying it must be nice to have celebrity problems while the rest of them stayed invisible, and soon I was sitting alone in the meeting room wondering if I'd somehow become the enemy just by being noticed. 3 days later at the courthouse, Ryan's lawyer stood up with a folder that made my stomach drop. He pulled out police reports from a shelter incident 4 months ago, where I'd shoved shoved another guy who tried to steal my medication, but the way he told it made me sound like some violent psycho who attacked innocent people for no reason. The photos showed bruises on the other guy's face from when he fell, and suddenly the jury was looking at me like I was dangerous. My lawyer tried explaining it was self-defense, but the damage was done, especially when Ryan's lawyer brought up 2 other times cops had been called to shelters where I'd stayed, both times because I was having nightmares and woke up swinging at shadows. Back at Marcus's apartment that night, he was going through Dad's old footlocker when he found the photos we'd avoided looking at for years. 3 generations of Torres men in uniform, each one coming home more broken than when they left. Grandpa after Korea with that 1,000-yard stare, Dad after Vietnam with hands that never stopped shaking, and now me after Afghanistan with a medal I couldn't look at without feeling sick. Marcus just sat there holding the photos while tears ran down his face, and I realized our family had been breaking apart in wars for 70 years. Month 6 of the trial came with crowds outside the courthouse getting bigger and angrier, veterans supporting me on one side, people supporting Ryan on the other, all of them screaming at each other while I had to walk through the middle every morning. The medal in my pocket felt like it weighed 50 pounds, and protesters kept shoving cameras in my face asking if I was proud of destroying an honest man's life. One morning, I was in the courthouse bathroom when I heard crying from the women's room next door through the thin walls. Through the sobs, I heard Ryan's wife on the phone with someone, saying she'd lost the baby from all the stress, that the doctors said her blood pressure had been too high for too long. I stood there frozen, remembering how she'd been pregnant at the first hearing, and now that was gone too because of what I'd started. Mitchell showed up the next week with a group of vets who said they'd walk me in and out of court every day, but having them there just made me feel worse. These guys had their own problems, their own PTSD and struggles, and here they were wasting time protecting me from angry crowds when they should have been taking care of themselves. I tried telling them I could handle it alone, but Mitchell wouldn't hear it, said brothers don't let brothers face fire alone, even though we all knew this wasn't the kind of fire any of us had trained for. The closing arguments painted 2 different versions of me that both felt wrong. The prosecutor called me a hero who'd been shamefully abused by power-hungry security guards, while Ryan's lawyer painted me as a calculating addict who'd played the system for sympathy and a payday. Neither side talked about what I actually was, just another broken vet trying to survive, because that truth didn't fit anyone's agenda. Month 7 came while we waited for the verdict, and I found myself walking the streets at night again like I had when I was homeless. Something about the empty sidewalks and cold air felt more real than the courtroom circus, more honest than everyone pretending I was either saint or sinner. I'd walk past the shelters I used to sleep in, the alleys where I'd hidden from rain, the dumpsters where I'd looked for food, and part of me wanted to just disappear back into that life where at least nobody expected anything from me. Then the jury sent a note asking the judge to clarify what reasonable force meant in the context of security guards restraining someone, and my lawyer's face went pale. She explained this meant they were seriously considering Ryan's self-defense claim, that maybe they thought he really had been justified in everything he did to me. The wait stretched into another week while they deliberated, and I could feel hope draining out of everyone on my legal team. At my next VA appointment, Dr. Wilson looked at my blood work and told me straight that my liver was failing faster than expected, that I needed to start treatment immediately, or I'd be looking at complete organ failure within a year. But I couldn't focus on anything she was saying because all I could think about was that jury room and whether they believed I'd somehow deserved what happened to me. She kept talking about treatment options and medications while I stared at the wall, wondering if it even mattered anymore. Marcus took leave from his job to be there for the verdict, and watching him sacrifice his career advancement for me just added another layer of guilt to everything else. His boss had made it clear that taking time off during their busy season would cost him the promotion he'd worked 3 years for, but he showed up anyway in his best suit, sitting behind me every day like he could somehow protect me from whatever was coming. Smart legal move by Ryan's lawyer, playing the he hit someone too card like it's some kind of courtroom Uno reverse, because clearly defending your medication from theft is exactly the same as targeting vulnerable veterans for sport. The bailiff called us back in after 3 hours of waiting, and I watched Ryan's lawyer whisper something that made his shoulders drop like someone had cut his strings. The jury foreman stood up with a paper that shook in his hands, reading out guilty on assault charges and civil rights violations, while Ryan's mother started making these awful sounds from the gallery that weren't quite crying, but something worse. Marcus grabbed my arm when my knees went weak, not from relief, but from this sick feeling that winning didn't fix anything, and Ryan just stared at me with dead eyes while the judge thanked the jury for their service. Outside the courthouse, the reporters shoved microphones in my face asking how it felt to get justice, but all I could do was shake my head because there weren't words for how empty this all was, how Ryan going to jail didn't give me back the months I'd lost or make my liver work right or stop the nightmares. His family clustered on the courthouse steps shooting looks that could have burned holes through concrete, and I saw his kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, learning to hate me the same way their dad did. Another generation poisoned by this whole mess. The judge announced she was delaying sentencing for a psychiatric evaluation, which seemed reasonable until the call came at 2 a.m. that Ryan had tried to hang himself in his cell with torn bedsheets, and even though they cut him down in time, I threw up thinking about how my need for justice had pushed another broken vet over the edge. 3 weeks later, the news covered how the governor's veteran initiative passed with funding from lawsuit settlements including mine, but watching her sign it on TV felt like watching someone else's life, because that money came from destroying Ryan's family, and Marcus losing his promotion, and me still waking up screaming most nights. At the sentencing hearing a month later, Ryan's mother approached me in the hallway with red-rimmed eyes and grabbed my hands, telling me he'd been a good boy before his deployment, before the IED that killed half his squad, and I understood too well how war breaks people in ways that never fully heal. The judge gave him 18 months plus 3 years probation, which the prosecutor called light for assault, but harsh for a first offense, and I watched them lead Ryan away in shackles while his mother sobbed, and his kids sat stone-faced, learning what justice looked like. The reporters wanted final statements outside, so I talked about systematic failures, and how Ryan was a symptom, not the disease, how we train people to fight then abandon them when they come home broken, but nobody wanted to hear about shared responsibility, comedy when they had a clear villain and victim. That night, Marcus called to tell me his wife Sarah had filed for separation, saying the stress and safety concerns from all the media attention and death threats from Ryan's supporters had become too much, that she couldn't raise their kids in this environment, and I listened to my brother's marriage fall apart, knowing I'd caused it by pursuing charges. The next morning, Dr. Moore called with news about an experimental treatment program for liver damage at UC Davis that might help, and Marcus drove me to the consultation, even though we both knew Sarah had asked him not to see me anymore, both of us silent about all the things this victory had cost us. The drive took 3 hours, and Marcus kept the radio on low, both of us watching the farmland roll by as we headed toward Davis, and when we got there, the treatment facility looked more like a regular office building than a hospital, which somehow made it easier to walk through the doors. The intake nurse recognized my name from the news, but didn't make a big deal about it, just handed me forms to fill out while Marcus sat next to me helping with the parts where my hands shook too bad to write clearly. They had a whole wing just for veterans, and walking down that hallway I saw guys my age in wheelchairs, on crutches, some just sitting in the common room staring at nothing. But what hit me was how nobody needed to explain anything, because we all knew without words what had brought us here. The first week was rough with the detox making me sick, and the nightmares coming back full force now that I wasn't drinking them away, but the staff knew what they were doing, and never made me feel weak for needing help. Colonel Mitchell started visiting every Friday, bringing updates about the security company that had fired Ryan and Walker, and was now making all their guards go through sensitivity training about veterans and homelessness. Small steps, but at least something was changing. Marcus came too, even though Sarah had filed for separation, and one afternoon we sat in the facility garden watching other patients tend the vegetables, neither of us talking much until he finally said what we'd both been thinking about: family, not giving up on family, no matter how hard things got. Group therapy showed me I wasn't special or unique, just another vet who'd fallen through the cracks, and hearing their stories made me realize this wasn't about individual failures, but systems that weren't built to catch people like us when we stumbled. After 2 months, they moved me to the outpatient program, and I started volunteering with the facility's peer support program, sitting with new arrivals who had that same lost look I'd had, helping them fill out the same forms that had confused me, showing them which doctors actually listened and which bureaucratic hoops were worth jumping through. That's when the letter from Ryan's mother arrived, forwarded through my lawyer, saying her son was in therapy now dealing with his own issues from his time in the service, both of us broken by different wars in different ways. The medal stayed in my dresser drawer at the halfway house, and some mornings I'd take it out and hold it, thinking about those 12 guys I'd pulled out of that burning vehicle in Kandahar, and wondering if any of them had ended up like me, if saving their bodies had been enough when the war followed us all home anyway. Marcus brought his boys to visit once I was stable enough, and we played catch in the facility yard while he and I carefully talked around all the things that still needed fixing between us, but at least we were talking. Dr. Moore ran new tests after 6 months and smiled when she showed me the results, my liver numbers improving slowly, telling me that same stubbornness that kept me going back into that fire in Afghanistan was what would keep me fighting here too. Today I was back at the facility, but on the other side of the desk, helping process intake for a new guy who'd been living under the freeway for 8 months, his hands shaking like mine used to, his eyes hollow like mine had been, and when he said the system was broken and nobody gave a damn about veterans once they were too damaged to be useful anymore, I pulled out the intake forms and started walking him through each one, telling him he was right about the system but wrong about nobody caring, because we were still here, still fighting, still refusing to let each other fall completely through those cracks, one form at a time, one day at a time, one veteran helping another navigate the mess we'd all been dropped into, and maybe that wasn't the happy ending people wanted to hear, but it was real, and it was enough, and it was what we had. I'm really curious about how all these support systems ended up intertwining. The facility with its veteran wing, the peer support program, all of it. There's definitely more to that story. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.